Hello and welcome to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I am your host, Adam Conover. Now, if you don't know what the podcast is, say you just tapped on it because it was alphabetically first in your podcast directory. And you're saying, what is this thing? I've started listening to it even though I have no earthly clue what it is. Well, I host a TV show on True TV called Adam Ruins Everything. It's an educational comedy show where I blow your mind with crazy facts. And on the show, I talk to experts from around the world of human knowledge just for a couple minutes, and we get their point of view on whatever the topic of the day is. But here's the thing, they have so much more to say. I am always, when they leave set, filled with questions and curiosity about the field that they study or the perspective that they represent or the world that they come from. This podcast is where we get to talk to them for a longer period of time, and I get to ask those burning questions and share the answers with you fine people at home. And that's what we're going to do today with my guest, Ed Ayers. But before I tell you who he is and what he's here to talk about, I would like to remind you that the TV show Adam Ruins Everything is coming back on August 23rd, Tuesday nights on True TV. And you can find clips and full episodes at truetv.com/Adam Ruins Everything and the Watch True TV app. We've got 14 big episodes coming at you, and you're going to love them, I guarantee. And I am also going on tour this fall, and you can find all of my tour dates at adamconover.net, not .com. .net, please, / there is no / it's just adamconover.net. You'll see a list of cities that I'm going to, and if your city is one of them, I invite you to come out and see me do some comedy for you. We're doing a big election-themed show. I'm going to be doing an hour of brand new comedy information, never-before-seen material on our election system, its history, its peccadillos, its quirks. I guarantee you will be enlightened and delighted by it. So I hope you come check that out. But now, back to the podcast, which is honestly, that's what you tapped on, so that's what you want to hear. Today's guest is Ed Ayers. Ed is a historian who appeared on the voting episode of the Adam Ruins Everything TV show. He is also one of the hosts of the public radio show and podcast Backstory with the American History Guys, which looks at current events in America through a historical lens. Guys, if you haven't heard this podcast, it's one of my favorites. It's an hour every week that covers incredible history stories, things you never knew happened in our nation's history. It's really a blast. Ed also happens to be the president of the Organization of American Historians and was formerly professor of history at the University of Virginia. But he's also just a really smart guy who knows a lot of cool things about history and is going to be a lot of fun to talk to. So I hope you enjoy the interview. And Ed is joining us remotely from Virginia through the magic of technology. Let's take it away. Hey, Ed, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
My pleasure, Adam.
And thanks for being on the show last year and helping, giving us so much more historical context for the story that we were telling. What was it like, traveling back in time on our sort of AirSats set?
I was amazed, in all honesty, how hard it is to produce a 21-minute comedy show. God, you guys work hard. It was, I was there for 2 days, and I was entranced the whole time. So the time travel was fun, but also getting a chance to see behind the scenes of television. It was magic.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I mean, I always tell people it's much less glamorous than I think they expect. It's a lot of being told to shift left and shift right, and it's always very like hot and sweaty, and it sort of seems to lack a little bit of Hollywood glitz and glamour. But that's for me doing it every day. So I'm always interested to see how it looks to an outsider.
It's fascinating, and and to see how the pieces come together. And that's what he was doing in the body-colored suit that he exploded. That looks cool.
Oh God, yeah. You saw me in. I believe there was a scene where I had to wear a dance belt, which is a flesh-colored sort of thong underwear, in order to do the scene where I arrived naked. And I think that was the day that I met you, which was pretty embarrassing.
Well, no, you really carried it off. So it was cool to see what it looked like with special effects. Maybe wish I had special effects all the time. And I often thought that if I just had people write my lines, and as I do on our radio show, had a chance to do things several times, I would be so much more impressive. But unfortunately, you get one shot at life, unlike entertainment.
Well, I was so happy that you were there to help help us understand, the history, because we, in that episode, really tried to tell a long, sort of narrative about the history of our democracy in a very short period of time, which there's so much to parse through. But what really struck me was how different our, founding fathers, like a conception of democracy was from ours today. We have this idea today that, all men are created equal means, every citizen should have one vote, and, that should be sort of a direct correspondence between, each citizen, like the majority chooses the
Right.
their sort of representatives directly. But that turns out to be very at odds with what the people actually founded the nation thought it should be.
Yeah, it's a paradox because it was, to coin a phrase, revolutionary at the time. I mean, and in the direction of democracy. And, killing the king, figuratively, is a pretty big deal. And so the trick is not to trivialize what they actually accomplished, but not to romanticize the legacy they left us. And I thought your show did a great job of sort of navigating that line. So, the Declaration of Independence is the seed that grew into the democracy that we imagine today. The Constitution they left us has had to be amended several times, more often about voting and what citizenship means more profoundly than any other subject. So this is sort of the big pivot in American history. If they hadn't started us toward democracy, we wouldn't be where we are today. On the other hand, they didn't get us very far down the road compared to what we want today.
Yeah, that's so fascinating because, I think there's an urge to think of the country that we have today as being directly founded by those men, right? That they got together and they, 200 odd years ago, set up the system that we have now, and that it hasn't changed. But, and I'm paraphrasing now based on a conversation that we had, nearly a year ago. So please correct me. But my memory is that you almost phrased it that the men who founded the country were sort of these aristocratic fellows who were, they had a lot of, Enlightenment ideals about, the people, having control over their own fate and ruling themselves. But they were simultaneously worried about sort of the rabble, taking their land or taking their wealth. Is that correct?
Well, they were worried about people taking them literally, which of course is what we've ended up doing. Mm-hmm. All men are created equal. So they knew they were taking the top off Pandora's box. I mean, one reason they were nervous, nobody made them do this. This is their own doing to create a more democratic nation. They just did not know how far democracy would run. And that's one reason, we always celebrate checks and balances in our civics classes, but they're putting checks and balances on a machine that they're the ones who've created and set loose. And, I think that on one hand, we are fulfilling the vision that they had of a democratic nation. On the other hand, they literally could not have imagined, first of all, women voting, of course, and of course, they could not really have imagined slavery coming to an end as it did, and then full citizenship and immigration. So I think that the impulse behind it remains constant, and I don't even know that they would be dismayed to see how it's turned out. They would just be amazed that the country has evolved this way in 225 years.
Yeah, one of the ways that you put it that I really loved was that, especially, for instance, talking about, them being slave owners or, the limits that they, placed on democracy in their own time was that their reach almost exceeded their grasp in terms of how much democracy they wanted to create. Like they, sort of had these ideals of all men are created equal, but they also had a little bit of real world fear or, restrictions that stopped them from actually extending the franchise that far. You're just talking about voting rights, but the ideals still meant that they put the tools in place that allowed us to expand those rights. Is that correct?
Yeah, what they really meant, all peoples are created equal. They didn't really mean all people. So what they meant is that the American colonies had the right to be of equal to the founding nation of England. And so, that's the reason we keep thinking, well, why'd they say men? Well, they were, of course, by our standards, sexist and racist and every other category, but they were also children of the Enlightenment who did believe that there were intrinsic rights. Now, one problem with all of this is that Thomas Jefferson, for example, believed that enslaved people had the right to rebel. That they were captives of war, and that they were. And one reason that people know this famous line, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we're afraid to let him go or to hold on." That's because he said, if all peoples are created equal, then the captive nation of African Americans had the right to rebellion. So they are limited in the ways that we are used to thinking about, but it's also that they, in some ways, that they imagine more of a tabula rasa than we do. You know, we begin with identity of our gender, our race, our religious belief or whatever, and kind of that's who we are and work out. Mm-hmm. They begin with the idea of, okay, here's the people, and equality flows from that. You know, they never would have questioned the idea that, of course, civil society is built around men who own property and have responsibility for their households, including servants and enslaved people. That just would not have been a question. That was, in fact, the way the society was built.
Right.
But on the other hand, they did imagine that slavery would fade away, is what they thought would happen at the time in the late 18th century, that the normal workings of the great watch, the great clock that was normal laws of the universe would tend toward democracy. So it's a fine line. It's always the case that, especially in schools, we romanticize the so-called founding fathers. And then, of course, we become, middle schoolers and we tear them down into complete hypocrites, right?
Yes.
And that's why the play Hamilton is so fascinating. That's really kind of exploded since we were on your show together.
Yes.
And to see the way that it has kind of taken that and turned it on its head in terms of, ethnic identity. But it's also said, wait, it really matters the things that they argued about. How strong the federal government was compared to the states and what the economic policy was. I mean, that's really one of the great hip-hop moments, the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson about, economic policy. But, those things did matter. And so the trick is to remain skeptical but not cynical about all this. And that's always the thing in American history.
Right. That's really fascinating. It almost seems as though when I think about the arc of American history that it's less that they sort of created the country, with perfect Enlightenment ideas, but it was more the fact that the structure of the government and the political society was capable of revision at all, that it was a government that was at least somewhat accountable to the people and which had processes, within it that could allow it to amend and change and reflect itself, or change itself in different ways. And then so simultaneously, as American culture began to value liberty or equality, right, and those values more, we were able to fold those into the structure of the government in a way over time. That's just me spitballing a couple hundred years of history off the top of my head. I wonder how that strikes you.
Well, it strikes me as very un-Adam-esque, frankly. You've taught me to be skeptical of everything, from wipes on down. And so, I'm skeptical of that. No, I mean, let me turn that a different way.
Please.
Yeah. As long as you have a war that kills the equivalent of 8 million people today, it's a system of infinite flexibility. And they had not changed the Constitution in any way that expanded rights until the Civil War destroyed slavery in the 13th Amendment and then added citizenship in the 14th Amendment and then removed voting restrictions in the 15th Amendment. So, that is two ways of looking at that, or many more than two, fortunately, or it keeps people like me in business. But the fact that the problem that they had built in of slavery, at the same time that they talk about all people being equal, helped generate the war in the first place.
Right. That's a very good point. Yeah, the fact that it took a war to create those rights is definitely a counterpoint to the picture I just drew.
But on the other hand, the fact that those rights emerged so quickly out of a war that did not begin to end slavery. I mean, the war begins to hold the United States together. And out of that process, and here's what I would say, Adam. If I'm giving you a grade, I'm going to give you extra credit because what you were saying on this was, it's true. because in the space of the war, of the Civil War, those rights assert themselves so rapidly and strongly. There's no other place in the Western Hemisphere of modern slavery in which the people who had been held in slavery become voting citizens within a decade. Mm-hmm. So there's different, there's no doubt in my mind that the profound tension, problem, unsolved paradox at the heart of American history is a democratic nation that is also the largest slaveholding nation in the modern world. And we're still, working through all of that. I mean, most of the problems that have come, including recent rulings of appeals courts about voting ID and all that, it's still a rolling out of the consequence of that tension. It is the most democratic nation in the world. It is also the largest slaveholding nation in the world. It's that those polarities are what still sort of pull so hard at the American nation.
And could you describe, just to return to something that you just touched on, the way that the seeds for the Civil War were planted when the nation was founded? Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is the Declaration of Independence. The people who are opposed to slavery, William Lloyd Garrison, talks about burning the Constitution because it's a pact with the devil. Because it acknowledges the 3/5 clause. Kind of what we did on your show, the fact that the deal is, okay, you in the South who have slaves get to count them as 3/5 of a person for a vote. That's a fundamental compromise built into the nation that allows the nation to be built. I mean, that's the problem. You don't have a United States if you don't make a deal about slavery.
Right, and that deal afforded the slaveholding, that deal which was made through the Electoral College afforded the slaveholding states more political power. Correct?
Yeah, they ran the country until the time of the Civil War, until the North grew so disproportionately that they said, no, you are not going to control the nation anymore, lead us into war with Mexico. Now you're talking about, taking over Central America, taking Cuba. You're talking about expanding slavery into the whole western half of the United States. No, we're not going to do that. I know that the Constitution gives you these rights with the slaves that you have now, but we don't think that it is congruent with the ideals of the American nation to expand slavery indefinitely. And so the South says, look, we're the fourth richest economy in the world by ourselves. We don't need you. We produce 80% of all American exports with slave labor of the nation. Great. We'll make our own country, and England and France and everybody else will kowtow to us, and we'll walk away from this. We'll have the same ideals as the United States, but we'll be based on slavery, without you guys constantly harassing us for being betraying the nation. So in many ways, the Civil War comes because both sides are claiming the same legacy of those founding fathers. Huh. As you showed in your dramatization of that, a lot of the founding fathers, of course, are big slaveholders from here in Virginia. And so they say, well, how can you say that we ruined the nation? We created it. And the North says, well, the fact is you cannot destroy the United States. Yeah. So that's how it grows in, is that, I could talk about this really for many hours, but it's a fundamental problem when people in the North see that slavery is growing stronger rather than weaker and threatens to sort of take the whole American nation hostage. The Founding Fathers believed that slavery would fade away, and in the Northwest Ordinance did stop its expansion, inspired ironically by Thomas Jefferson, in which they said these new states of what we now call the Midwest would not have slavery. And they said, look, it's clear that the Founding Fathers did not intend for slavery to saturate this whole country, and that's what you in the South are wanting. That's really what the Civil War is about, is what is the future of slavery? And so that's how it all comes about. So it's a fundamental, one way to think about this is the irritant, like an oyster. It's planted at the very beginning, and it pushes until you get the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. And then, of course, the great 100 years in which the North says, okay, that's enough. Black people in the South, you're on your own. And then black people have to fight for themselves to have the nation live up to its ideals. So I think, you really can tell the story of American democracy through the story of African Americans, of how it begins with slavery and then is transformed into a more fully democratic nation, and then sort of short circuits for 100 years. And then in the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement finally delivers on what had been promised in the late 18th century. I think that's, and then, the interesting thing is that lots of other people who are not African American benefit from the expansion of this notion of what it means to be a citizen. Of course, the 14th Amendment says if you're born in this country, you're an American. That's the fundamental fulfillment of the founding moment, that everybody in this country is an American. And it took the war and the end of slavery to bring that about. So it moves in jerks. It's not a gradually unfolding, flower of democracy. It's violent surges, and we may be seeing something like that today.
Right, and it seems like we're at a moment when we're starting to doubt the institutions of democracy more than we have in a long time. Just the meme of the system is rigged that's going around this year. Just to take one example, but then the fact that Supreme Court seats are being left unfilled, and these sort of like basic mechanisms are breaking down, and that there have been recent court decisions that have been rolling back those Voting Rights Act provisions and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that people are announcing on the left and the right that the system is rigged is a sign of great alarm. Now, of course, it has been rigged,
Yes.
in the sense that you guys dealt very effectively with it in the show. We had that scene of disfranchisement of African American men lining up to vote and being defrauded and intimidated away from it. What's more of a rigging than that? So, it's kind of ironic that, and now these recent appeals court cases say these voter ID laws in North Carolina, Wisconsin are illegal, so that people keep trying to rig it, try to stop people from voting. And this impulse that the founding fathers had at the beginning keeps reasserting itself. So ironically, at a time when you have a broader array of Americans than ever before voting, we're explicitly skeptical about the system. But what people forget is the system was explicitly, so-called legally, rigged for 100 years after the Civil War.
Yes, I mean, whenever I, read about the history of our nation's elections or the history of how various presidents got into power, it always strikes me that the system has always been rigged more in the past than it is today. Or there are always shocking examples of incidents that we would now consider incredibly undemocratic, way beyond anything that's happening today. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you think in the way some people think we're slipping backwards?
Well, I mean, what's more rigged than saying if you're a woman you cannot vote?
Right.
I mean, and then what's more rigged than saying you got to pay poll tax or you've got to risk your life to vote? So one way to think about this is for 50 years we've had a system in which women and African Americans can legally vote. And you've seen a revolution in many American cities and counties where African-American people now are mayors and run things. And we take it for granted that women are, in positions of authority. So, pulling the camera way back and looking at it, the things that we're talking about rigging today, like the primary system that leads to delegates for a convention, seems very small amount of rigging compared to the deprivation of the vote for half the population, and then for an entire swath of the population who's African American. So, I think that actually the talk about rigging is an example of higher expectations that's going to lead to a more democratic system. I think it's good that people have such high expectations that every vote counts. Especially from some quarters, strikes me as more adequately expressed than in others, is a good sign. It shows that we take it seriously enough to care about it.
Yes, it shows that people have, the sort of folk understanding of democracy is very strong, that people, we've sort of all been taught in school, one person, one vote, you pick the president, you pick the candidates. And it almost strikes me that especially with the primaries, that it's, the sort of like basic understanding people have of, no, my vote should choose the candidate. This should be direct and clear and transparent, when the fact is that the party nomination processes have never really been that clear and that democratic, and that the expectation of the people is bumping up against the reality of the process in a way that sort of speaks to how strong the idea of democracy is for Americans anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the process has never been more inclusive than it is today. I mean, that's just a fact. People talk about smoke-filled rooms and stuff. Well, now we're talking about, an incredibly long primary process in which apparently anybody can run, and that people can say whatever they want to say. It's interesting, though, that only 9% of the American population has chosen Trump and Clinton. Despite all of that. And so a lot of the deprivation of democracy is self-inflicted, people just not showing up to vote. I think that's going to really be the issue for the general election this fall, is what percentage of people are motivated enough to actually vote. And so you'll see, in some ways, people are protesting by threatening not to vote. And so they want to have a system that's inclusive, but the main thing that they would do to resist it is not to vote at all. So, yeah, I think we're kind of schizophrenic about this, but it's a good kind of schizophrenia. It's an expectation, a frustration, an impatience with anything that hinders what you've described as sort of one person, one vote right now in the way that I want it. That's okay. It's built into the process.
Well, I'm here talking to Ed Ayers. We'll be back in just a moment, so please stick around.
Going into a Bullseye interview, I know it's somebody who does amazing work, but it's an actual conversation. I don't know where it's headed.
Hey, this is the straight talk that you're going to get on this show.
Does that make sense? I feel like I'm in therapy.
I think I got more out of you than the therapist I went to twice.
Bullseye. Creators you know, creators you need to know. Find it at MaximumFun.org or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I'm here talking to historian Ed Ayers, who appeared on the voting episode of Adam Ruins Everything. Let me pose a sort of a historical question for you, because
right.
I've thought a lot about, just some broad historical themes here. We talk about how the founding fathers, were frightened about mob rule, right? And so they wanted a buffer, and they created a lot of buffering organizations like the Electoral College. I've also read how the Senate was sort of designed to be a more aristocratic body that wouldn't be directly chosen by the people in order to be a buffer from the people, because they were worried that the people would mob together and vote for a demagogue or a crazy person, right? So fast forward to now, and it seems like people have a real rejection of any of those buffering qualities. Like, they don't want, the frustration with superdelegates, right? Superdelegates look to me like a similar sort of buffering body where those are members of the party, people who've put their time in, they've put in their 20, 30 years, and they're sort of part of the political organism, and they can, hopefully be a little bit of a buffer so that nothing goes wrong. And then you look at the Republicans who don't have superdelegates, and it turns out someone who has been described as a demagogue did run away with it by sort of, inciting people's passions. So one might ask, and I'm not suggesting personally, but I think it's an interesting question to pose. Like, was that impulse correct to a certain degree to have those buffering qualities? Like, is it something that we want to have in democracy, or are we better off, like leveling everything so it literally is just, people directly picking the nominees?
Well, if you think about the countervailing structures, they are still democratic. I mean, people still vote for the Senate. Right. And people are still voting for the delegates to the convention. So, and I think one of the things that people are frustrated about right now is that the parties still have power, even though people know that Donald Trump has not always identified as a Republican, and people know that Bernie Sanders has not always identified as a Democrat.
Right.
And yet the delegates for both are furious when the two parties don't just adopt them, right? So it's not only the Supreme Court and the Senate. People don't want any structures of control at all. I don't want to trivialize any of this. All these strike me as legitimate longings for a true democracy.
Right.
But in some ways, it's been sort of saturated by modern social media and technology, where everybody does have more of a voice than we did 5 years ago, and also anybody can write reviews on Amazon, and everybody, and so it's not hard for me to imagine that in 20 years, a lot of this machinery does fall away, and you do have more direct democracy, and the things that people are expecting in their lives of consumption and of expression will become more imaginable in the world of voting. Now, events like of the last few months may give people pause, and they may actually say, wait, I see why we have a Supreme Court that reviews decisions of state courts when they are making decisions that seem just outlandishly wrong to me. When a governor can come in and sort of reorient an entire state, or when a General Assembly falls over to another party, and suddenly laws of people's most intimate lives are changed overnight, I think that people can see the reason that to have authority that is not immediately based in the locality or in the people. Now, here's the interesting thing to think about. Would we have the Civil Rights Revolution if you'd only had direct democracy? The white South did not ever just say, hey, what were we thinking?
Yes.
Segregation is wrong. If
Yes.
you did not have federal authority coming in and saying you are violating fundamental principles of the nation with this kind of local democracy, right?
Wow,
You've got
what a
white
good point.
people. So
Yeah.
we're scrambled. People imagined in different ways that local and small and immediate is more democratic. But the story of the Civil Rights Revolution suggests that, no, sometimes remote and larger frames of reference are actually more democratic than what people might create in their own communities.
That's such a fascinating point that if it had been a purely direct democracy, the racist white Southerners would have been able to. They never would have done it by themselves if it hadn't been imposed upon them by sort of elites telling them what to do, basically.
Yeah, well, and even if you'd had a vote in 1861, all white Americans, raise your hand. How many of you want to end slavery immediately with no compensation for the slaveholders and votes for the people who are held in slavery right now? I don't think it would have won.
Right.
Abraham Lincoln wins 39.8% of the vote in the North. I'm sorry, in the whole nation. But then, even in the Civil War, he only wins 55% of the vote in 1864. After all these years of sacrifice and Northern victory right on the cusp of things, nearly half of white Northern men won't vote for Abraham Lincoln. So that gives you another glimpse at if you have unmediated democracy, you don't end up with a more democratic nation.
That's so fascinating, yeah. Or you'd end up with a more equal nation, certainly. I guess the sense that the sort of meta idea that I'm getting here is that we do need these organs of government that are less democratic in a real sense, that are Supreme Court justices appointed to lifetime terms, or party leaders who's have some ability to contradict the will of the people to a certain degree. Like, there are real instances in which you need that sort of mediating force, but it really is contrary to a deep belief in democracy that Americans have. There's a real tension there.
Yeah, I would say just saying it's democratic or undemocratic, Adam, might not get at it. Mm-hmm. It's immediate democracy versus sort of what the founders of the Republic called the Republic, right? In which there's a machinery of democracy, that things that are undemocratic in the sense of Supreme Court justices appointed for life are there not to resist democracy, but, as we've seen in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, to enable democracy because they are not immediately beholden to getting elected the next time, right? So they could actually do something that's in the spirit of the founding goals of the nation without ever having been elected. So, I think what we're always worried about is what sometimes they don't do things, that are Citizens United, for example. A lot of people think, treating that corporations are people and can spend, as much money as they want to elect who they want to. Well, that's a court decision as well, right? That seems undemocratic. So we're just going to have to get used to the idea that we're never going to be comfortable, and we've never got it. It's just built in that it's going to. This is the way democracy looks. It's awkward and halting and sometimes retrograde, and it often feels dangerous. It often feels like, whoa, things are out of control, either veering too far toward unmediated democracy by people who aren't really thinking through what they're voting for, or on the other hand, that we want this good thing and the majority wants it and the darn courts or the Senate or whoever just won't let us have it. And, it's built in that whatever politics we have, somebody in the government or somebody in this democratic system is really hitting us the wrong way. But, it's interesting in their last two conventions to see how people claim the mantle of who's patriotic. For a long time, the Republicans had a monopoly on that. The American flag lapel pins and all the, bunting and stuff. This time, the Democrats seized all that.
Right.
The parents of the young soldier who was killed and so forth. And so I think if we imagine that there are forces of democracy that are arrayed just on one side or the other, rather than it being a whole language that's up for grabs all the time by whoever can make, the loudest noise. That's just kind of the system we got.
What you just said about the conventions is so fascinating because that really struck me as well, that, as someone who sort of grew up, or I came to political consciousness during, the Bush years when, the Republican Party was the party of standing up and saluting at a football game,
Yep.
And to see the Democrats, start the USA chant was such a striking moment to me. And it did, my sense is that, this is an election where, we're starting to see the parties sort of change their alignments and change what parts of the electorate they're sort of, building into a coalition in a real way. Does it feel that way to you?
Yeah. I mean, people forget, that the Democrats won World War II. in the sense, FDR saw all the way through, right? And it was Democrats, on the other hand, who dropped the atomic bomb and dragged us into Vietnam. Right. And so I think that people with short memories, younger people such as yourself, perhaps,
it only goes back 30-odd years,
Exactly, well, older people like me can remember. Of course, and if you live in the past for a living, you can see farther back and you realize that these things oscillate.
Yes.
Is that it certainly did seem over the last 30 years that the Republicans had, basically because of Reagan, had claimed patriotism. But patriotism for good and bad has been as much a Democratic thing. If we want to think of patriotism as foreign policy, the Democrats have done more to shape American foreign policy in the 20th century than the Republicans have. And it's kind of interesting that has become, our memories are short. And we think of, mission accomplished and all that as a Republican thing, but the Democrats talked much the same way when they were in power.
Right. We also forget that, we now think of the Democrats as being the party of civil rights, but in fact it was Southern Democrats who stopped civil rights for decades and decades.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that's a great point, Adam. Thanks for making that point because, the New Deal, as revolutionary or as evolutionary as it was, pulled up short on race and on lynching of all things,
right.
Because the Democrats are running that local power. So I think that it's one thing that you were fascinated with in the show was the Electoral College.
Yes,
and that's an interesting way that a lot of this gets mediated as well. You go back and look at maps of how people voted, you realize, that the country just makes these massive shifts several times in the 20th century. There's no reason to believe that we're not getting ready to live through another massive shift.
So, that's a question I wanted to ask you. Does this, everyone is saying, just people I talk to on the street. Well, I don't really talk to people on the street. I live in L.A., so, but, everyone says, this is
the juice shop. You probably talk to them.
Yeah, in line for our smoothies at Moon Juice.
Yeah, exactly.
people say, "Oh, this is the craziest election ever. This election is so strange and so bizarre." People are saying, "Oh, this is 1968 all over again," or whatever. That kind of there's a sense that people have that this is a historically anomalous election cycle, and I just wonder, as someone who knows a lot about a lot of election cycles, does it strike you that way?
It's pretty weird. I'd have to say, that, and, the Democrats are kind of following the script,
right.
In the sense of kind of succession of power within the party, paying your dues and so forth. I do think that we may be seeing something on the Republican side that we've seen before, but it was in the 1850s when the Whig Party fell apart and the Republicans arose for the first time. That is the clearest example of when a party has, and the Whigs were as strong as the Democrats for several decades before the Civil War, and then sort of dissolved. I don't think the Republican Party is going away, but it's clearly being sort of reconstituted before our eyes. And it's interesting, too, on not just patriotism, but on other kinds of issues, the parties seem to be sort of unstable about what they be. Trump is not really saying the things that Romney or McCain said about, foreign exchange or, government spending or entitlements. I mean, we would not have imagined just a year ago that the Republicans would not be talking about those things as their primary purposes, because they have defined, even in your lifetime, that's what they've always talked about, right?
Yes.
They've always, keep government small, keep taxes down, stop this deficit, and suddenly they're not talking about it at all. So I think it's, what will be interesting to see is the extent to which the personality-driven politics that we have right now with Donald Trump, what they do to change the Republican Party itself. Whatever happens, let's imagine he does not win. Will Ryan and the other established leaders say, well, okay, that was a close call. We better incorporate something of what Trump was saying into our new platform? Or do they say, that was a close call. Let's get back to what we really believe in. So I can't think of a time in which the main candidate and the party have been at such odds since the election of 1864, when George McClellan runs for president against Abraham Lincoln. And the Democrats wait till the last minute to let the Civil War go as badly as it possibly can for the North. No, really. I mean, and his platform is for peace. Let's negotiate peace. Now, so this is fall of 1864, and some of people who might not be completely on top of their Civil War chronology, that's only 6 months before the war is over.
Wow.
And they're still talking about let's make peace with our Southern brothers, right? And so they have this. They postpone the convention as late as possible in order to harvest as much of this discontent as possible. They put this peace platform. They nominate George McClellan, who writes a letter kind of accepting what the platform and kind of doesn't. Mm-hmm. And immediately Sherman takes Atlanta. And so this claim that Lincoln and the Republicans have botched the Civil War and lost it, or not, immediately. And so there's a quote they said, as they were traveling back home, from the convention in Chicago, they could see themselves being burned in effigy as they were coming back into town, because people are celebrating the fall of Atlanta, and they think that when with Sherman's march, the Civil War is going to come to an end. So I think that's the closest analogy I think of. Just happens to be in the period that I study, but I think it's true. The disappearance of the Whig Party in the early 1850s, the emergence of the Republican Party thereafter, the nomination of George McClellan for a platform that just disappears.
I asked you if you thought this was a historically remarkable election, and the two you compared it to were one where a political party collapsed and one during the Civil War. So I think maybe it is safe to say this is a historically remarkable election. We just don't know what the change is going to be yet, because we have yet to see the results.
Exactly. I tell people I don't want to hear them use the word antebellum before the war, because we're always living in an antebellum period. We just don't know when the war's coming. right?
And that's such a bleak picture. Well, we're always before some war.
Exactly. And we're not calculating our lives by a chronology that we don't know is coming. So I'm not a bleak guy, so let me give it this. You put your finger right on it, Adam, when you say we don't know how this is going to turn out. This is either a Goldwater election of 1864 that leads to the Democrats coming into such power that they're able to create the Voting Rights Act.
Right. 1964, right? You said 18.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I tend to do that since I tend to be living in the 18th century, 19th century more in my mind. Yeah, it's 1964, or it's 1980, in which you find out of the Republicans are able to portray the preceding administration of Jimmy Carter in this case as a muddled mess, and you need to seize it and have morning again in America or make America great again. And then they seize power. So it's hard to see how it's not going to be an important election.
Right.
I think the big question is whether or not the Democrats, if they win, and at this moment here in August, it looks as if that's the way things are looking, that they're able to bring the Senate and the House along with them. And if they can, then you are looking at another sort of great society moment, I think, when Johnson has, Congress at his command, and they're able to do things like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So, or what you could have is an incredibly estranged electorate, just more of what we've had with a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, in which people are even madder than they were before.
Right.
And so it's hard to see that we're going to see a Republican president and Republican Congress. But even if that happens, when he has basically renounced that party, what's that going to mean, right? So I think we're in for interesting times regardless of what happens.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, it's such a far cry from, a couple decades ago when everyone was saying, well, it doesn't, the presidents are so similar, you might as well vote for Ralph Nader. It's such a different climate. I did want to get to this question that I remember when we were chatting on set. I was reading at the time a big heavy presidential biography. I won't say which one, so I won't ask you to comment on a colleague. But I was it's like the kind of big old biography a dad gets for Christmas. And I said, oh, what do you think of this book? And you made a comment to the effect that, oh, well, that sort of history is all well and good, but that what you were really interested in as a historian was work that moved our understanding of history forward, is the way that you put it, I think. And I was really interested in that distinction because, to me, I had always assumed the study of history was like, well, we're just going to find out what happened, and then you just read it, and it's the work of a historian is just to tell us all, tell those of us who don't know what happened in the past. And I never thought of it as a field. It's in the past. How could it move forward? And so I was wondering if you could expand on that idea.
Well, thanks for giving me this opportunity, Adam. This is the one thing that makes me so angry I can hardly stand it. So
I love it.
I always quote my mom, who was a fifth grade teacher, and I told her I was going to go to graduate school in history. And she said, well, what for, honey? We already know what happened. And it's very much like what you just said. Let's put it this way. If that's what my job was, I'd shoot myself. Just repeating the same things we already know. I mean, academic history is like every other academic discipline. We live for discovery and for originality. Now, that is not, the books that you're talking about are called uncle books. They're books that you buy for your uncle for Christmas or a birthday. And they're beautifully done. There's obviously a huge demand for them. They're often biographies. People want to know. So I'm not dismissing them. It's just if we settle for just repeating what we already know or translating it into a story that's easily palatable, we don't actually perform our jobs as historians, which is to find what we don't know about the past. I'm an Americanist, but by the standards of my profession, I do journalism. I'm just a 19th century person, right? People who do ancient history or medieval history or history of China in the 17th century. I mean, that's harder in many ways, but they don't get to be on Adam Ruins Everything. So I wouldn't trade places with them. But there are things that we are still discovering about the ancient world, centuries, millennia later. And it's not just because our predecessors were stupid or, were blinded by their, prejudices. It's that there's always new evidence coming about. So in our own time, think what it means that if people would think, okay, what is history? And think of it instead as the most popular hobby in the nation, which is genealogy. Okay? Think what Ancestry.com, and let the record show I have no economic arrangement with them.
No sponsorship.
No. I would welcome one if anybody from Ancestry is listening and would like to talk with me. But to think about what that means, that's in the last decade, you're able to go online and see the evidentiary base of your family's history. That is a revolution. What if we could do that for the whole nation? I've spent a lot of my time and energy over the last 25 years of imagining history in digital form. I do have something I'd like to plug here.
Please do.
People go online and look at American Panorama. It's a digital atlas of American history that we're making at the University of Richmond with a grant from the Mellon Foundation. And it imagines history in an entirely new way. So related to what we were talking about just now, it shows the forced migration of African Americans from 1820 to 1860 with a map that sort of areas that are losing black population are varying shades of blue and areas that are gaining are varying shades of red. It's kind of pulsating. You see that it's not like a big red arrow like in the textbook, where it's moving from here to there or the Great Migration. Here's an arrow from Mississippi to Chicago. Well, it's not like that. It's like an fMRI of our brains, that's got all these nuclei in movement. And another map of the foreign-born population of the United States from 1850 to 2010. And it shows for every county in the United States in each of those years where its people came from. And you click on it, and it sends out tendrils around the world for where people came from, right? So it's got billions of pieces of evidence in it across all of American history. Literally, we are seeing things that we have never seen before, that our minds, our analog minds, just cannot imagine that much. We can't picture simultaneity. Okay?
Right.
The best we can do is, meanwhile, or back on the ranch, right? We can't really tell two stories at one time. So we have millions of pages of newspapers that we've never been able to read with electronic amplification before, to go back and find the patterns across 100 years of different ways that we've used language and stuff. So history I believe, getting ready to undergo a great revolution in which we're able to see all kinds of things that we could never see before.
Wow, that's such an incredible vision. I mean, yeah, because we think of even the 19th century history as being like, oh well, we probably know what happened because it's in books, it's in newspapers. But that's a way of like doing data analysis even on history is something that wouldn't have been possible until recently. And I did go to the site after we talked on set actually, and it was sort of like kind of like the graphic you would expect to see on one of those fancy New York Times graphics about some piece of data mining they did, but on like historical movements of people. And I hadn't really had an appreciation for what the Great Migration meant until I saw that. And so that's a way that piece of information, you're not just educating people about it, you're actually adding new information to our understanding of that period that we literally didn't have before.
And inviting everybody to, and this goes back to the theme of this conversation, to participate in understanding their own history, right? So if history is not just the some people telling other people what to think about the past, but instead is enabling people to find themselves in the flow of time, that's what we do. What is history? It's how the heck we got here. Mm-hmm. What could be more useful than that? Really?
Right. And I'm so struck by what I love about Backstory, just to laud your own work for a moment, is that I love the way each of the guests on the show brings about a new perspective to a period that I thought I knew something about, just through, the history. It sort of gives it this fractal quality where the more you look at it, the more you, have to discover and learn. But yeah, there's just so many like little micro movements or
Exactly.
justifications for events that we didn't understand, or small revolutions that that nobody appreciated until this moment. Just sort of continue to add context.
Yeah, and there's been a revolution in history over the last 50 years in which, think about this, not only do women get to vote, they get to be in history. And not only are African Americans enfranchised, they are actually, think about the revolution that we're seeing in, the big movie of the year, Birth of a Nation, about Nat Turner's rebellion. It's coming up Sundance, right? Our vision of the past is becoming radically democratized. And it goes hand in hand with this impatience that you're talking about, with people talking about the system being rigged, my voice can't be heard. People are now demanding a voice in America's history. And that's what makes Hamilton such a big hit. The fact that people of color are starring in our history.
Right.
So even though I get up every day and think about the worst things in American history for a living, I'm very optimistic because I can see that for the first time, a young person of any background will have access to seeing him or herself in the story of their nation.
Right.
And how is that not the foundation for a better democracy going forward? If you don't think you have a stake in the nation, if you don't think that you have a part in the story, if you don't think that people like you helped make the country that you live in, why should you care? Why should you have any faith that it could ever be better? In this case, if we can make history more inclusive, and not just by adding, people of different skin tones in the illustrations for the textbook, but rather let's rethink history from the ground up to include everybody.
Right.
Then what would the story look like? So that goes back to your original point about presidential biographies and things, right? Well, if your main point of history is to include everybody in the story, we're going to have to find new ways of telling the story. Now, those maps I showed you are great, but they're not a story. Now, that's what's great about backstory, and thanks for the plug. I would say this. Our last episode about women voting, I listened to it in the car with my wife on a recent trip, and I came to the end. I said, I have to admit, I didn't know any of that until we made the show. There is so much to be discovered every week. And I find that exciting and liberating. So the thing is that history is as exciting as science. We just need to start telling that story in a way that's about discovery rather than passing on civics lessons. And that's the reason I love being on your show. You kind of got to blow up the old story before there's space for the new story. And so that's why, a skeptical attitude is good. Not because it makes you, give up, because it makes you demand more of our nation's history. And there's a lot more there than we've ever tapped.
Oh, man. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end it. Thank you so much for saying so. And I do want to say that is the goal of the show, is to unearth things that we didn't know about ourselves and tell those stories that haven't been told. And I think that's why, even when and that's why I love talking to you about these topics, because there's so much of our own history that we think we know, but we don't actually hold the truth in our heads while we talk about it. We talk about what the founding fathers wanted, but we don't have that thought of what they were really like, as we're doing that. Having that context makes our understanding of the present so much richer. Oh, whatever. You just said everything that I'm trying to say so much more eloquently.
Well, let me say it this way. I noticed that you in your TV show, and congratulations on the new season coming up, by the way.
Thank you very much.
The same way that we tend to end backstory, which is like, wow, wasn't that discouraging? But on the other hand, just because you discovered all this stuff that you didn't know, it doesn't mean you give up. It just means you reframe the story.
Right.
That you reframe your actions. So that's the thing. If you don't know where the dangers lie, you can't lay out a safer course, right?
Right.
If you don't know what the problems are, you can't solve them. So I think that's what history and Adam Ruins Everything have in common.
I think you're absolutely right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Ed. It's really wonderful to talk to you as always.
My pleasure, Adam. Good luck with your new season.
And that is it for Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. Thanks again to Ed for coming on the show. We will be back in 2 weeks, so please tune in then. Our producer is Shara Morris, and the show is produced by Maximum Fun, which is a great podcast organization. If you like the show, please be sure to tell a friend and subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to leave us a rating or comment whenever you subscribe. And once again, Adam Ruins Everything, the TV show, is coming back at you August 23rd. You can find clips and full episodes at truetv.com/AdamRuinsEverything, and then watch True TV app. And once again, please go to my website, adamconover.net, not .org, not .tv, .net, to see my tour dates, where I don't need to be so specific with you guys about the URL. You're smart people. You understand. You can Google it and you'll find it. But on that site, you will find a list of tour dates, cities that I'm going to in September and October, all across the country. I hope you'll come out and see me, give me a hug, and say hi. Until 2 weeks from now, see you later. Bye-bye.
MaximumFun.org.
Comedy and culture.
Artist owned.
Listener supported.